The protocol thing is still rumbling on. Do you think it's do you have a sense that maybe it's not as severe as perhaps is being projected?
There's a lot of grandstanding going on, there's no doubt about that. I don't believe that they cannot come up with a solution that will allow the DUP to save some face and also perhaps tinker with the arrangement, which obviously has problems. But when you see the congressional delegation arriving in Ireland, it's another indication, I suppose, of the endurance of the inability for these things to be solved locally. And of course this has all sorts of different international dimensions now. But there is grandstanding going on. There's a power game going on within the Tory party as well, which is part of it. And then I was intrigued by those alleged comments of Liz Truss, the British Foreign Secretary, in 2019, where she was very dismissive of the idea of Brexit complicating things in Ireland, and referred to turnips.
Yes.
And a few farmers with turnips in the back of their truck. And, that for an Irish audience is a reminder of the endurance of another very difficult approach to Ireland on the part of the Tory, or insensitive approach to Ireland on the part of the Tory party. Like it harks back to the Punch cartoons of the 19th century, and there's a condescension and a snobbery there that brings out your inner nationalist. There's no doubt about that. She hasn't confirmed or denied that she said that, but it's very plausible, isn't it? And it's very believable. So that is one aspect to it. I mean, I'm very conscious that many people have asserted over the last week or two that Anglo-Irish relations are at their lowest ebb in a long, long time. And they are in a very difficult situation, there's no doubt about that. But we also have to remind ourselves of really dark days in the 70s and the 80s. I remember reading the transcript of the phone conversation between the Taoiseach Jack Lynch and the British Prime Minister Ted Heath on the night of Bloody Sunday. When you think of the enormity of those events and what was at stake. And there were difficult days in the 1980s as well. But, Thatcher was somebody that the Irish government could do business with. Yeah. For all of her status as a hate figure for Irish Republicans and nationalists. The difficulty, I suppose, is what goes on behind the scenes is much more important. Like, we can talk about grandstanding and the rhetoric from the leaders and the well-known politicians. Progress in Anglo-Irish relations comes about as a result of what is done quietly.
Yes.
By the civil servants, by the diplomats. It's all about increments. Can we edge towards some kind of a consensus? The problem at the moment is that is not going on a fair to the extent that it needs to go on. And having said that, the relationship between leaders is important. And there isn't really any trust there, obviously. How can you trust someone like Boris Johnson?
Well, that is a problem. Yeah.
That's a huge problem. And, it was interesting. He wrote a very long piece for the Belfast Telegraph there last week. And he brought up this issue of the strategic interest of the UK in Northern Ireland. And you remember that hugely important statement from 1990 that Northern Ireland had no selfish strategic or economic interest in Northern Ireland. That allowed an awful lot of things to happen subsequently. The Downing Street Declaration, the momentum in the 1990s that ultimately led to the 1998 agreement. And what Johnson is saying now, of course, Northern Ireland is of great strategic importance. Now, why is it of strategic importance? Because he wants to present himself as the saviour of the Union and of the Union. And you have to wonder at the same time, how much interest is there in Northern Ireland?
Well, that's the thing that baffles me. His constituency isn't in Northern Ireland. They know little and care less about Northern Ireland.
He's looking at tools that are useful for him in a bigger battle, which is about being able to say that I have finally done this, I've got Brexit done, and I have managed to stand up to the EU. And it's been referred to Northern Ireland as not just a problem child, but a pawn and even a hostage. And they did a survey of the Tory party in 2019, and 59% of them said that they would rather see Brexit done than for Northern Ireland to remain in the United Kingdom. If it came to a choice between the two, that's very, very revealing. But there's no consistency, obviously, with Boris Johnson. And again, the DUP are depending on Johnson to make the move.
But they don't trust him either.
Well, why the hell would they trust him? But where else can they go? And this is the dilemma for them. And I mean, this isn't about ignoring unionists, obviously. That's not going to get us anywhere. And history would show that there has to be dialogue open. And they will talk to these American politicians as they come over. But I fear there's some exaggeration on the part of the American politicians as well, that they can veto any possible Anglo-American free trade agreement. It might not be as straightforward as that. But you do have at the moment what John Peck, who was a British ambassador in Ireland in the early 1970s, referred to as brawling in public. And this is a part of the history of Anglo-Irish relations. You have that. Another British ambassador in Ireland, Alison Goodison, referred in the 1980s to a raw nerve that never sleeps. And what had happened was that the raw nerve was at rest for quite some time. There was an awful lot of positive rhetoric 10, 12 years ago about Anglo-Irish relations at an all-time high. We had the Queen's visit, and that sense that, we had finally come to a mature stage where we were diplomatic equals. And there could be respect afforded. Of course, Brexit upturned all of that, and the consequences are going to play out over a very long time. What's the big problem at the moment is that the British government is sending out completely conflicting signals, because Boris Johnson says, no, we don't have to rip up the Northern Ireland Protocol, but we need to fix it. Whereas Liz Truss is essentially saying, I'm going to bin it. I'm going to introduce legislation to bin it. Now, that legislation, if and when it's introduced, is going to have to snake its way through Parliament as well. And it just means it'll be drawn out. It'll be a very long drawn out. And we're coming into, of course, summer recess as well within politics and in Northern Ireland. So it must be incredibly frustrating. But for all of the focus on what happened in 1998 and the Belfast Agreement, the Good Friday Agreement, we do need to start wondering now if parts of that need to be revisited. In
terms of how elections are organised.
Yeah, and how people are designated, and whether or not it can do justice to the new shape of Northern Ireland politics. Now, for all of the talk of change in the Alliance Party, there's still a lot of continuity in Northern Ireland politics. You have to acknowledge that. But, boxing them into those designated boxes of orange or green doesn't seem to fit the new shape of Northern Ireland politics, but also even in relation to a lot of ambiguity. I'd often say to students of history, let's look at what's in the document. Let's also look at what's not in the document, which can be as important. All of the talk of a border poll in recent years, it doesn't actually, in the agreement, spell out what a Northern Ireland Secretary of State will be guided by in relation to whether or not he or she should call a border poll. It just says that, if the Northern Ireland Secretary feels that there might be a majority in favour of United Ireland, he or she can call a border poll. But how do you actually do that? What yardstick do you use? What's the measurement for whether or not there is either an appetite or demonstrable desire for a border poll. So there's a lot of ambiguity.
But it's just as dangerous to include some sort of criterion in it. If it's 50% plus one, that's probably not going to help anyway.
And I mean, that's a majority. And of course, those who have looked at this question of how it might work insist that, well, it has to be a majority or it doesn't. And if that's 50 plus one, so be it. Whereas others would argue, given the history of Northern Ireland, that is not going to work. So you have all of these different issues being examined again. The difficulty at the moment, I suppose, is just dealing with a British Prime Minister who, doesn't have any consistency ideologically or intellectually in how he approaches these issues. And he's a complete messer.
And while all that happens, and Liz Truss's legislation, as you say, could take God knows how long to get through the Houses of Parliament, there will be no Stormont Assembly.
No.
Do you think that actually has an effect on Northern Ireland?
Well, I've been talking to people in Northern Ireland about that over the years, because you'd be up and down for various academic things and different events. And what always strikes you when you're up there is that people are just getting on with it because they're used to stalemate.
Yeah.
And they're used to the politicians not working. Now, they are getting more and more annoyed, particularly when it comes to politicians being paid at a time when they're not taking their seats. And then some would argue quite convincingly, of course, and quite justifiably, that they can't take their seats because, one portion of politicians have a veto over it. And yet, Northern Ireland can still function. Northern Ireland still does function. I mean, we've had these very prolonged standoffs and stalemates before, and people get on with it. But it does breed a cynicism, of course, about the inability of them to resolve differences. I suppose what really has changed fundamentally is the loss of unionist supremacy in Northern Ireland, and that for them psychologically is hugely difficult. But it's also something they have to come to terms with, and their politics has to adapt. And even listen to Doug Beattie, who would see himself as a more progressive unionist as leader of the Ulster Unionist Party, which is now a much smaller entity, obviously. But he's talked about the need for an agile unionism.
Yeah,
The idea of agility within unionism, particularly for a certain cohort of unionists in the DUP, is not something they can countenance either. But no, I think that's always very interesting that you go up to a place like Belfast and things are ticking along.
Yeah.
You know? And
you'd wonder also, like, does the DUP have a long game in mind at all?
Absolutely
Other than
not.
let's just stall things as long as we can.
No, that's a very important question. It doesn't have a long game. And that's where it's been outwitted, really, by Sinn Féin, who can be quite sophisticated in how they approach the long game, you know. And you can see even with how they handled the recent election. You know, you don't talk up the border poll in the middle of an election and you focus on other things. And they're quite strategic. They've always been strategic in how they've approached politics. Whereas the Unionists don't have that same sophistication when it comes to mapping out their strategies or their alternatives at different stages. And that's why they're in kind of permanent crisis mode. And then the rhetoric and the language that they use is infected by that. So everything is highly dramatic and everything is very emotive. And, you know, wrap around that the question of the future of the union, you know, and you can see how they will insist that this isn't just about the Northern Ireland Protocol, this is about the future of the Union. But that assumes, of course, that there are those who want to take them into the bosom of the Union, and there's no evidence of that.
Yeah.